this is Catherine from Accelerated Reader. Today I will be reading Mr. Tannen's Ties. Mr. Tannen is the principal of the Lynnhurst Elementary School. All the children love him, and they also love his ties. Every morning, as the children enter the school, they check out Mr. Tannen's tie. It's a good way to start the day. Mr. Tannen has quite a tie collection. Funny ties, crazy ties, holiday ties, ties that play music, and even ties that light up. He also has a big collection of tourist ties. Anytime students go on a trip, they bring home ties for Mr. Tannen. His office closet bulges with ties. He changes his tie several times a day, depending on his mood, the weather, or what's for lunch in the cafeteria. On Frankfurter Friday, he always puts on his hot dog tie. No one will know if I get mustard on it, he says. If the weather suddenly changes, so does his tie. If he is wearing his umbrella tie, you know that it's raining even before you look outside. And for official duties, he always wears his red, white, and blue tie with yellow stars. One day, Mr. Tannen had an important meeting with Mr. Apple at the school department. Everyone in town called Mr. Apple Mr. Crabapple because he was always grouchy and never smiled. Of course, Mr. Tannen wore the appropriate tie. Mr. Tannen, Mr. Apple began, you are a fine principal, but there is one thing that concerns me. What's that, Mr. Apple? Asked Mr. Tannen. Education is serious business, said Mr. Apple. Absolutely, agreed Mr. Tannen. You are a role model for your students, said Mr. Apple. Mr. Tannen nodded. Therefore, you should look proper at all times. Mr. Apple pointed to Mr. Tannen's tie. And that is not proper. He handed Mr. Tannen a plain blue tie. This is. From now on, Mr. Tannen, keep your silly ties in your closet. You are to wear only blue ties. Mr. Tannen was shocked. No sports ties with soccer balls? No. No tourist ties with palm trees and pink flamingos? No, Mr. Tannen. No light-up tree ties at Christmas? No, Mr. Tannen. Blue ties. Just blue. The next day, Mr. Tannen greeted the children as usual. But something was not right. Mr. Tannen, your tie. It's just plain blue, said Alex. Mr. Tannen felt just plain blue. He sighed. Sorry, kids. It's proper blue from now on. Strict orders from Mr. Apple. Boring, said Carlo. How are we going to know the weather? Asked Olivia. Or what we're having for lunch, said Kaylee. Mr. Tannen shrugged sadly. Mr. Tannen didn't feel like talking to anyone all morning. At lunch, he wished he had on his hot dog tie. When the second grade celebrated Kristen's birthday, he couldn't wear his special tie that played Happy Birthday to You. Alex was worried. Mr. Tannen is not the same, he thought. Early Monday morning, the school secretary phoned Mr. Apple. "Sir, Mr. Tannen just called in sick. He will be out all week with the blues. You will have to come to the Lynnhurst School to fill in as principal." The children were surprised to see Mr. Apple greet them at the door. "I will be your principal for the week," he snapped. "Let's have straight lines, no talking, no running." "I miss Mr. Tannen already," whispered Alex. That afternoon, Mr. Apple even made recess rules. "No playing on the wet grass," he yelled. "You'll track mud in the school." Recess was no fun. The kids were happy when the bell rang. As they were filing in, they saw Mr. Apple climbing a tree. "What's he doing up there? Spying on us?" asked Kaylee. "I can't believe it. He's bird watching," said Olivia. "He actually looks happy," said Carlo. But that gave Alex an idea. On Tuesday, Alex gave Mr. Apple a tie with birds on it. "Thank you, Alex, but that's not quite my style." When he was alone, Mr. Apple stared at the tie. "Cardinals are my favorite bird," he thought. He held the tie up to his plain gray suit. He couldn't help but try it on. After school, Mr. Apple wore his new tie to the grocery store. "Hello, Mr. Apple," said the cashier, Miss Sweet. "Good day," mumbled Mr. Apple. "Lovely tie," commented Miss Sweet. "You must like birds. I'm crazy about cats." Mr. Apple smiled a little. On Wednesday, Mr. Apple picked up his mail. Then he sat at Mr. Tannen's desk to work. But today he couldn't concentrate. He opened Mr. Tannen's closet and searched through the ties. He found just what he was looking for. In the afternoon, he went to the grocery store again. He got in Miss Sweet's checkout line. "Mr. Apple, now that's a charming tie." Mr. Apple and Miss Sweet chatted for a long time. On Thursday after school, Mr. Apple thumbed through Mr. Tannen's ties again. This time he heard music. It was coming from a tie. Mr. Apple headed to the grocery store. When he got to the register, he pressed the tie. It played, "Let me call you sweetheart." "Mr. Apple, I never knew you could be so delightful," said Miss Sweet. Mr. Apple handed Miss Sweet a rose. "Will you have dinner with me tonight?" "I would love to, Mr. Apple." On Friday morning, Mr. Apple greeted the children wearing a tie with red hearts. "Isn't that Mr. Tannen's Valentine tie?" asked Alex. Mr. Apple grinned. "Well, I don't think he'd mind if I borrowed it, do you?" "He won't mind," shouted all the kids. On Monday, Mr. Tannen came back to school. Mr. Apple was waiting at the door. "That tie, Mr. Tannen," grumbled Mr. Apple. "Sorry, sir. Got a stain on it. Mustard," apologized Mr. Tannen. "Well, it's a good thing I bought you another one," said Mr. Apple. He handed Mr. Tannen a box. Mr. Tannen sighed. He opened the lid. A big smile spread across his face. "It's just your kind of blue," said Mr. Apple. Then Mr. Apple gave him a shopping bag filled with letters. The kids have been writing me letters all week. They want their principal back, and so do I. Thank you, Mr. Apple. One other thing, said Mr. Apple shyly. Can you lend me this wedding bells tie? I have an important date tonight. The end. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know in the comments below what books you'd like for me to read next. As always, thank you for listening.